But machines can break. The more Rome expanded, the more pressure weighed upon its armies. Defending borders from Britain to Mesopotamia strained manpower and treasure. Eventually, cracks appeared, and enemies learned to exploit them. Yet, in the time of the unstoppable emperors, the Roman military machine was still the hammer of the known world. And it was this hammer that they wielded with terrifying precision. For without it, no emperor could claim to be unstoppable.
Why do certain battles stand out as turning points in history? Why does the clash of armies in a single day, sometimes in a single hour, determine the fate of empires? For Rome, 3 battles reveal not just military genius, but the will of emperors who seemed unstoppable. Actium, where Augustus seized power. Dacia, where Trajan expanded Rome to its furthest extent. And the Milvian Bridge, where Constantine not only secured an empire, but altered the very course of religion. These were not ordinary confrontations, they were gambles with the destiny of the known world.
Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a warship in 31 BCE. The Ionian Sea is churning, sails creak in the wind, and across the water lies the fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. To your left, Octavian's forces, led by his brilliant admiral Agrippa, prepare to strike. The outcome of this battle will decide more than victory. It will decide whether Rome continues as a fractured republic or consolidates under one ruler. Antony's fleet was massive, boasting larger ships bristling with soldiers. Cleopatra had brought Egyptian wealth and prestige to his side. By numbers alone, Octavian should have been crushed. But here lay the genius. Octavian didn't rely on brute force. He relied on maneuver, attrition, and psychology. Agrippa had already cut Antony's supply lines, forcing his fleet into a corner. Hungry men fight poorly. Then, in a moment of high drama, Cleopatra's ships suddenly turned and fled mid-battle. Was it panic? Was it part of a plan? Historians still debate, but to the men of Antony's fleet, it looked like betrayal. Confidence collapsed, formations broke, and Octavian's smaller, faster ships pressed the attack. Antony abandoned his fleet to follow Cleopatra, sealing his doom. Strategically, Actium was more than a naval skirmish. It was the moment Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor. The Republic was dead, replaced by a system centered on one man's power. And it began not in the halls of the Senate, but on the rolling waves of battle. Ask yourself, if you were Antony, would you have pressed the attack despite dwindling supplies, or retreated to fight another day? His choice to stand and gamble cost him everything. A century later, Rome faced a different challenge. Across the Danube lay Dacia, a mountainous kingdom rich in gold and led by a fierce king, Decebalus. For decades, Dacians raided Roman provinces, humiliating legions and threatening Rome's prestige. When Trajan took power in 98 CE, he resolved to end the threat once and for all. The campaign was a masterpiece of logistics and engineering. To even reach Dacia, Trajan ordered the construction of a massive bridge across the Danube, designed by the genius Apollodorus of Damascus. Spanning over a kilometer, it was not just a crossing, it was a declaration. Rome would go wherever it pleased. But the battles were no less brutal. Dacia was a fortress land, with strongholds perched atop mountain ridges. Roman legions advanced through treacherous terrain, facing ambushes from warriors who knew the hills better than any invader. Yet Trajan adapted. He didn't simply storm fortresses. He cut off supplies, surrounded strongholds with siege works, and slowly squeezed his enemy into submission. At the climactic siege of Sarmizegetusa, the Dacian capital, Trajan's engineers diverted rivers to undermine defenses. Imagine the shock of defenders watching their water supply vanish, knowing thirst would kill them before the sword. Decebalus fled, but Roman cavalry hunted him down. Rather than be captured, he committed suicide, a moment immortalized on Trajan's column in Rome.
The victory was stunning. Rome annexed Dacia, securing immense wealth in gold mines that fueled the empire's prosperity. Statues of Trajan spread across the empire, proclaiming him Optimus Princeps, the best of emperors. Yet here too, triumphs carried seeds of strain. The conquest extended Rome's frontier further than ever, requiring constant defense against new waves of tribes. The gold brought temporary prosperity, but could not erase the mounting costs of empire. Still, in his lifetime, Trajan seemed unstoppable. His legions carved roads into mountains, erased kingdoms from maps, and declared that no land was beyond Rome's grasp. Would you, in Trajan's place, have risked overextension for glory? Or would caution have kept Rome safe, but limited in ambition?
Fast forward to 312 CE. Rome is divided, torn between rival emperors. At the gates of the capital, Constantine confronts Maxentius in a battle that will determine control of the empire. But unlike Actium or Dacia, this clash carries a different dimension: religion. The night before the battle, Constantine claimed to see a vision, a cross in the sky, with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether divine revelation or clever propaganda, it became the defining symbol of his campaign. His soldiers marked their shields with the Christian Chi Rho, marching into battle under a new banner of faith.
Maxentius, confident and overextended, chose to fight near the Tiber. His army was large, but his position was flawed. He built a temporary bridge to control the crossing, but when the battle turned, that bridge became a death trap. Constantine's forces pushed Maxentius's men back in disciplined formations, driving them into the river. Thousands drowned in panic, and Maxentius himself perished in the water. Strategically, Constantine displayed the same mastery as Augustus and Trajan. He combined psychological warfare, the vision of divine support, with tactical exploitation of terrain. His army fought with discipline. Maxentius's men fought with desperation. The result was decisive. But the true significance lay beyond the battlefield. Constantine's victory established him as sole ruler of the West. More importantly, it marked the turning point for Christianity. No longer a persecuted sect, it became the favored religion of the empire. Within decades, Christianity was not only legal, but dominant, reshaping Roman culture, law, and identity. What if Constantine had lost? Would Christianity have remained a minor sect, crushed under persecution? Or was its rise inevitable, with or without him? History offers no certain answers, but the battle at the Milvian Bridge gave Christianity its empire. The pattern of genius. These three battles, Actium, Dacia, Milvian Bridge, reveal a pattern. Rome's unstoppable emperors did not simply command armies. They understood the battlefield as an extension of politics, religion, and destiny. Augustus turned a naval gamble into the birth of empire. Trajan transformed engineering and discipline into conquest at the edge of the world. Constantine fused faith with strategy, securing both throne and church. Each battle illustrates choices that could have gone differently. If Cleopatra had not fled, Antony might have triumphed. If Trajan's bridge had failed, Dacia might have remained unconquered. If Maxentius had held firm, Constantine's vision might have been forgotten. Yet, the decisions of these emperors and the discipline of their troops tipped the balance. Cliffhanger transition.
But battles alone did not make these men unstoppable. Behind every victory lay politics, intrigue, and betrayal. After Actium came the purges of rivals. After Dacia came the strain of defending overextended frontiers. After Milvian Bridge came the delicate balance of integrating an empire under a new faith. The battlefield was only half the story. The other half unfolded in the corridors of power, where daggers in the dark were often deadlier than swords in the field. And so, as we move from battlefield glory to the shadows of Roman politics, we must ask, who truly held power in Rome? The legions, the Senate, or the man bold enough to command both? Why did Rome's legions, forged on the battlefield, so often turn their swords inward against their own city? To answer that question, we must step away from the clash of shields and into the marble halls of the Senate, the smoky corners of private villas, and the whispered chambers where ambition and fear shaped the fate of an empire. For Rome, politics was never just words and laws. It was war by another means, and more often than not, it was deadlier. The Roman Republic had been designed with a brilliant but fragile balance of power. Consuls commanded the legions, the Senate guided policy, and magistrates upheld the laws. Yet every victory abroad planted seeds of discord at home. Every general who returned in triumph brought with him not just gold and slaves, but also the loyalty of hardened soldiers who had shed blood under his command. Consider this. A senator might command respect within the curia, but a general like Marius or Caesar commanded something far more potent, men willing to die for him. And that imbalance would soon destabilize the republic itself. Take the rivalry between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, perhaps the most vivid early example of how political disputes bled into outright civil war. Marius, the new man who had risen from outside the traditional aristocracy, reformed the Roman army and gave landless citizens a place in the ranks. Sulla, aristocratic to his core, represented the entrenched elite. Their hatred for one another was not merely personal, it was structural. Marius embodied the new Rome of professional soldiers tied to their general. Sulla, the old guard that sought to keep senatorial dominance intact. When Marius attempted to block Sulla's command against Mithridates of Pontus, Sulla responded in a way that shattered precedent. He marched his legions on Rome itself. Imagine the shock. Roman soldiers storming through the streets of their own capital, swords drawn not against barbarians, but against fellow citizens. This was the day Rome learned that her legions could be turned inward. But the Marius-Sulla conflict was just the beginning. Each factional struggle created precedents, and those precedents became weapons. Sulla, once in power, unleashed proscriptions, a bureaucratic form of political murder. Lists of enemies were posted publicly, and anyone on them could be killed, their property confiscated. For ambitious men, it was a lesson. Politics in Rome had become a battlefield, and survival required not just rhetoric, but ruthlessness. One could almost hear the whispers in the forum, "If Sulla could do it, why not I?" The ambitions of generals were mirrored by the ambitions of the Senate, whose members feared yet relied upon the very men they sought to restrain. The Senate's attempt to check power often backfired. Take Julius Caesar. His rise was not inevitable. It was cultivated by years of maneuvering, alliances, and manipulation. When he joined forces with Pompey the Great and Crassus in the so-called First Triumvirate, it was less a formal government and more a cartel of power. Pompey had military glory, Crassus had wealth, and Caesar had political cunning. Together, they outflanked the Senate, pushing through laws and securing commands. Consider what you would have done in Caesar's place. Stripped of command, you risk humiliation and possible prosecution. But with loyal legions at your back, you can seize power itself. Caesar chose ambition, and from that choice came civil war. Pompey, backed by much of the Senate, retreated to the east, gathering armies. Caesar struck with speed, overwhelming Italy, defeating Pompey in Greece at Pharsalus, and cementing himself as master of Rome. The Republic, already fragile, cracked under the weight of such concentrated power. Yet Caesar's triumph was also his undoing. The Senate, though weakened, retained its traditions and its pride. Many senators could not stomach the transformation of Rome's leader into something resembling a king. Caesar's assumption of perpetual dictatorship was the final straw. Brutus, Cassius, and their fellow conspirators believed they were saving the Republic when they plunged their daggers into Caesar on the Ides of March. But in reality, they doomed it. The assassination unleashed yet another round of civil wars, pitting Caesar's heir Octavian and loyal general Mark Antony against the assassins, and then against each other. Each conflict only eroded the Republic further. By the time Octavian emerged victorious, reborn as Augustus, the Republic was dead. In its place stood the Empire.
But let us not overlook the quieter, subtler forms of intrigue that were just as decisive as battle. Consider the role of propaganda. Roman leaders were masters of image-making. Coins bore their faces, triumphal processions displayed their victories, and speeches painted rivals as enemies of the state. Cicero, for example, wielded rhetoric as a weapon sharper than any gladius. His denunciations of Catiline's conspiracy did more than expose a plot. They elevated Cicero's own stature as defender of the Republic, while branding his enemies as traitors. Words could condemn as effectively as swords.
There was also the manipulation of religion. Omens, auguries, and sacred rites were political tools. A bad omen could delay a rival's campaign. A favorable prophecy could justify a bold gamble. Caesar himself claimed descent from Venus, binding his image not just to power, but to divinity. Augustus would refine this further, cloaking his authority in the language of restoration, piety, and peace. By presenting himself not as a tyrant, but as the bringer of order after decades of chaos, he made monarchy palatable to a people raised on republican ideals.
What's striking is how often personal vendettas determined the course of history. Take Mark Antony and Octavian. Their initial alliance, sealed after Caesar's assassination, was always tense. Antony's affair with Cleopatra was more than a scandal, it was a political liability. Octavian seized on it, painting Antony not as a Roman statesman, but as a puppet of the Egyptian queen. This was propaganda at its most effective. When the two clashed at Actium, it was not merely a naval battle. It was the culmination of years of political maneuvering, propaganda wars, and personal rivalry. Antony and Cleopatra's defeat sealed Octavian's path to absolute power. And yet, for all the scheming, one truth stands out. Rome's greatest danger was always Rome itself. No foreign enemy, not Carthage, not Parthia, not the Germanic tribes, ever posed as lethal a threat to the Republic as its own ambitions. The legions that crushed Hannibal at Zama, that stormed the walls of Jerusalem, that marched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, were turned time and again against their fellow Romans. Political intrigue transformed generals into kings, senators into conspirators, and citizens into exiles. Rome's destiny was written not only in the sand of battlefields, but in the marble of the Forum and the blood spilled upon it. Think about this. If the Senate had embraced reform, if ambition had been checked by compromise, could the Republic have endured? Or was it always doomed, its expansion creating pressures that no constitution could contain? The very brilliance of Rome's military machine created generals too powerful for the old system. And once the precedent of marching legions into Rome was set, the Republic's fate was sealed. In the end, the political intrigues of Rome remind us of a timeless lesson. Power is never static. It shifts, it corrupts, and it consumes. The Republic did not fall in a single moment. It unraveled through decades of betrayals, ambitions, and calculated gambles. Each assassination, each alliance, each march on Rome chipped away at its foundations until nothing remained but the shell of tradition, and beneath that shell, absolute rule.
So, as we leave the world of senatorial debates and whispered conspiracies, we turn to the next question. How did this fractured system, so riddled with treachery and ambition, give rise to an empire that would dominate the known world for centuries?
This is the story of calculated patience, political genius, and the transformation of Rome from a republic fractured by civil war into a unified empire under the rule of one man.
Octavian entered history at the most precarious of moments. Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE left Rome in chaos. Senators thought they had restored the Republic by murdering the dictator, but they had only unleashed another storm. Civil war loomed, and every ambitious man in Rome saw opportunity in the void. For Octavian, Caesar's chosen heir, the stakes were personal. He was young, barely 18 and untested, yet he carried Caesar's name, his inheritance, and most importantly, the loyalty of many of Caesar's veterans. The first test was survival. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and a man of proven military skill, dismissed the youth. He believed Octavian could be controlled, or better yet, swept aside. But Octavian proved far shrewder. He courted Caesar's veterans with lavish promises, secured the loyalty of the people through public games and distributions, and forced his way into Roman politics. By 43 BCE, the boy no one took seriously was consul of Rome. Why was this possible? Because Octavian understood Rome's new reality. Power no longer lay in the Senate chambers, but in the legions. Without soldiers, one was nothing. With them, one could dictate the fate of the Republic.
The formation of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE was both a pragmatic alliance and a death sentence for the Republic. Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus joined forces, each bringing soldiers and resources. Together, they presented themselves as avengers of Caesar's death. The Senate, powerless to resist, legalized their extraordinary rule. The price was blood. Proscriptions were unleashed, lists of enemies condemned to death, their property seized to pay soldiers. Rome trembled as noble houses were stripped bare and ancient families extinguished. Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic, was hunted down and killed. Octavian personally sanctioned his death, despite having once benefited from Cicero's support. It was a cold demonstration of Octavian's ruthlessness. The boy was gone. In his place stood a man willing to sacrifice principle for power. The triumvirs marched east to confront Caesar's assassins. At Philippi, in 42 BCE, Antony and Octavian crushed Brutus and Cassius. Antony's skill in battle proved decisive, but Octavian claimed equal credit. With the Republic's defenders destroyed, the triumvirs divided the Roman world. Antony took the east, Lepidus the provinces of Africa, and Octavian the west. But such power sharing could never last.
The next decade was a slow-motion duel between Antony and Octavian. Lepidus faded into irrelevance, leaving two titans. Antony commanded vast resources in the east, allied with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Together they controlled wealth, fleets, and armies. Antony, once Caesar's right hand, seemed destined to inherit his mantle. Yet Octavian understood something Antony did not.
Rome's heart still beat in Italy. The Senate, the people, the veterans, they were the center of legitimacy. Antony might dazzle the East with Cleopatra's riches, but to Romans, it reeked of decadence, of a man seduced by foreign luxury. Octavian exploited this masterfully. He launched a propaganda war, painting Antony as a traitor to Roman values, a man who would hand Rome to an Egyptian queen. Cleopatra became the perfect villain, exotic and dangerous, while Octavian posed as defender of Roman tradition, even as he dismantled it. Strategically, Octavian's brilliance lay not in the battlefield, but in logistics and narrative. He settled veterans with land, ensuring their loyalty. He secured grain for Rome, stabilizing the city. He positioned himself as the champion of Italy, while Antony seemed ever more distant. When Octavian read Antony's will before the Senate, claiming Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome, it was a masterstroke. To Romans, this was unforgivable. Antony was no longer one of them.
But how does one transform military dominance into lasting rule? Octavian understood the danger of appearing a tyrant. Julius Caesar had made that mistake, and it had cost him his life. Octavian chose a subtler path. He presented himself not as king, not as dictator, but as princeps, the first citizen. He restored the outward forms of the Republic. The Senate still met, magistrates were still elected, laws were still passed. Yet behind these forms, Octavian held the real power. He commanded the legions, controlled the treasury, and dominated foreign policy. The Republic had become a mask, and behind it stood monarchy in all but name. In 27 BCE, the Senate bestowed upon him the title Augustus. It meant the revered one, carrying a sacred aura. This was no longer merely Octavian, Caesar's heir. This was Augustus, the founder of a new political order. Strategically, Augustus's genius lay in creating stability. He reduced the size of the army, keeping only those legions he could pay and control directly. He created the Praetorian Guard, soldiers stationed near Rome itself, ensuring his personal security. He reformed the provinces, cutting corruption and streamlining taxation. For ordinary Romans, weary of war, Augustus delivered Pax Romana. But Augustus knew peace required constant vigilance. He expanded Rome's frontiers, pushing into Spain, the Alps, and the Balkans. He reorganized client kingdoms, ensuring loyalty. And at home, he invested in grand building projects, temples, forums, theaters, reminding the people that under Augustus, Rome was not only safe, but flourishing. Yet perhaps Augustus's greatest achievement was psychological. He made Romans believe the new order was natural, even necessary. Where Caesar had provoked fear, Augustus inspired acceptance. Where Antony had seemed compromised by foreign luxury, Augustus embodied Roman tradition. He styled himself as the guardian of morality, even promoting laws to strengthen marriage and family life. He tied his rule not only to power, but to virtue. Was it manipulation? Undoubtedly. But it was also effective statecraft. Augustus recognized that empires cannot be held by force alone. They must also command belief. By the time of his death in 14 CE, Augustus had ruled for over 40 years. He left Rome transformed, no longer a republic torn by ambition, but an empire united under a single ruler. His reign laid the foundations for centuries of Roman dominance, a legacy so enduring that when later emperors faltered, they were measured against him. Augustus had begun as a youth, dismissed by veterans and mocked by rivals. Through patience, calculation, and relentless will, he had achieved what no Roman before him had accomplished: the transformation of the Republic into empire. The question that remains is this: did Augustus save Rome by ending the chaos, or did he doom it by destroying liberty?
Why does the Roman military still command our imagination 2,000 years after its legions marched their last campaign? Was it their relentless discipline, their tactical ingenuity, or the sheer audacity of an empire that once stretched from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the windswept highlands of Scotland? To understand Rome's enduring power, we must trace the legacy it left behind, not merely in ruins and monuments, but in the very DNA of military organization, strategy, and empire building that continues to shape the modern world. At its core, Rome's legacy lies in how it professionalized war. Before Rome, most ancient armies were seasonal, levied from farms when the planting was done or the harvest complete. They fought for kings or city-states and disbanded just as quickly. Rome changed this. By the late Republic and into the Empire, the legions became a permanent institution. Soldiers were not just farmers carrying spears for a summer campaign. They were professionals, serving 20 years under oath to the state. That oath, sacramentum, bound them not to family or tribe, but to Rome itself. It was this professional standing force, loyal and relentless, that made Rome's expansion sustainable.
Consider the structure of the legion. At around 5,000 men, it was not a clumsy mass, but a carefully balanced machine. Centurions drilled their men daily, instilling discipline so intense that even under the chaos of battle, formations held. Tactics like the testudo, the tortoise formation, where shields locked above and to the sides, were not improvised tricks, but rehearsed maneuvers perfected through constant training. This emphasis on standardized tactics and formations allowed legions to fight in Gaul, Judea, or Germania with the same cohesion. Their adaptability became their hallmark. But Rome's genius was not just organizational, it was engineering. No army in history marched with such deliberate preparation. Roman roads, straight and enduring, were not merely civilian marvels, they were arteries of conquest. A legion could move 20 miles a day, carrying its own equipment, establishing a fortified camp each night with mathematical precision. These camps, standardized in design, became temporary cities of war, with ditches, palisades, gates, and ordered streets. Enemies who looked upon them realized they were not facing mere soldiers, but an entire system, a self-contained war machine.
And yet, Rome's military brilliance extended beyond raw power. Strategy was as critical as steel. Roman commanders were masters of logistics, recognizing that armies march not on glory, but on grain. Vast supply chains fed their soldiers, while conquered lands were reorganized to sustain garrisons. This logistical foresight allowed Rome to hold territories far from the Italian heartland, projecting power across continents where other empires had faltered. But we must ask, why did this military system endure in memory long after the empire crumbled? The answer lies partly in how Rome's military ideals were transmitted. Medieval kings studied Roman texts like Vegetius's De Re Militari, a late Roman manual emphasizing discipline, fortifications, and cavalry tactics. Though written in an age of decline, its lessons echoed for centuries, guiding generals from Charlemagne to Machiavelli. The Renaissance rediscovery of Roman strategies fueled new European armies, and the Enlightenment revived admiration for Roman discipline and engineering as models of state power. Rome also left behind physical reminders of its militarism. Archaeological digs uncover not only swords and helmets, but the remains of camps, watchtowers, and frontier walls.
The most famous, Hadrian's Wall in Britain, still snakes across the countryside, silent testimony to Rome's military reach. These fortifications show Rome's understanding that conquest was only half the battle. The other half was control. By building barriers, forts, and networks of roads, Rome transformed landscapes into controlled military zones. This interplay between expansion and consolidation remains a fundamental principle of empire even today. Yet, the Roman legacy is not without its darker lessons. Rome's reliance on the military as a tool of politics planted the seeds of its own downfall. During the Republic, the Senate commanded legions, but as ambitious generals like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar gained personal loyalty from their troops, the balance shifted. Soldiers fought not for Rome, but for the man who promised them land, plunder, and pensions. This militarization of politics led directly to civil wars that shattered the Republic. The very professionalism that had made the legions strong also made them dangerous. Consider the year of the four emperors in 69 CE, when legions stationed across the empire declared rival claimants to the throne. Power no longer lay solely in Rome. It lay wherever the strongest legions marched. From that point forward, emperors ruled at the pleasure of their soldiers. Some, like Augustus, mastered this dynamic by rewarding their troops generously. Others, like Pertinax or Caracalla, paid the ultimate price when they failed to do so. Rome's history reminds us that a professional military, once politicized, can as easily unmake a state as defend it. And still, the military spirit of Rome survives in ways we scarcely notice. Modern military ranks, centurions inspiring today's centurions of leadership, the eagle standards mirrored in modern regimental banners, the very idea of boot camp training owes something to Rome. The principle that soldiers can be drilled into an effective unit, regardless of background, is Roman through and through.
The tactical lessons also endure. The Roman emphasis on combined arms, integrating infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineering, finds echoes in today's doctrines of joint operations. Their logistical genius, moving supplies with speed and precision, resonates with modern military planners. Even their failures are instructive. The disastrous defeat at the Teutoburg Forest, where 3 legions were ambushed in dense German woods, remains a case study in overextension and the perils of underestimating local resistance. Military academies still analyze it as a warning that technological superiority and discipline cannot substitute for cultural intelligence and terrain awareness. But beyond tactics and logistics, Rome's true legacy lies in its vision of military power as the backbone of civilization. For centuries, Roman citizens understood that the stability of their world, its laws, roads, aqueducts, even its peace, rested upon the sword. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was not the absence of war, but the suppression of it through overwhelming force. Rome taught the world that empires are maintained as much by deterrence as by conquest.
And yet, here lies the paradox. Rome's military brilliance sustained it for centuries, but it also trapped the empire in a cycle of perpetual expansion. The machine needed new wars to feed its soldiers with loot and land. When expansion slowed, the system strained. Recruiting became harder, pay inflated, and the empire leaned on foreign mercenaries to fill its ranks. The very structure that had once been Rome's greatest strength turned brittle, vulnerable to fracture under pressure from barbarian invasions and internal usurpations. So what, then, is Rome's ultimate military lesson? Perhaps it is this: no army, however disciplined, can sustain an empire forever. The legions were unmatched in their time, yet their power could not prevent the gradual erosion of Rome from within. Corruption, overreach, and the politicization of the military hollowed out the system. By the 5th century, when Germanic tribes swept into Italy, the legions were a shadow of themselves. The empire they once forged collapsed, but the idea of Rome's military supremacy endured.
Today, when generals and statesmen reflect on strategy, they still invoke Rome. Its roads, its camps, its discipline, its failures all remain part of the conversation. Rome's military was not just a machine of conquest, it was a laboratory of power, testing ideas of organization, loyalty, and control that continue to define how nations wage war. So consider this. If you were a Roman commander, standing at the edge of the empire, facing enemies who outnumbered you, would you trust in the strength of your legions, in the loyalty of your men, or in the structures of empire that supported you? Rome's legacy challenges us to ask not only how it conquered, but how it endured, and how, in its eventual collapse, it still managed to shape the art of war for millennia to come. Why does Rome still haunt us? Why, after 2 millennia, do we continue to speak of its legions, its emperors, and its empire as if they had only just fallen yesterday? The truth is simple. Rome never truly vanished. Its military innovations, political structures, and cultural ambitions echo across every age that followed. But the shadow of Rome is not a uniform one. It is both glorious and dark, an inheritance of genius, but also of destruction.
Consider first the battlefield legacy. Roman formations, from the manipular legion to the later cohort system, were more than just tactics. They were a language of discipline and cohesion. Generals like Scipio Africanus, Julius Caesar, and Trajan used the Roman army not merely as a tool of war, but as the very instrument of policy. Their campaigns fused conquest with statecraft. When we examine modern military manuals, we still find echoes of Roman principles: unity of command, logistics as the lifeblood of strategy, and the critical balance between flexibility and discipline. Clausewitz may have written centuries later, but he was describing dynamics the Romans understood intuitively.
And yet, the Roman example also serves as a warning. Why did such a system collapse? How could a machine so efficient eventually fracture under pressure? The lessons are stark. Rome teaches us that no military power, however supreme, can exist without political cohesion. The empire did not fall simply because of barbarian invasions. It fell because its internal divisions eroded its ability to resist. The legions fought with courage to the very end, but their commanders were often more loyal to their personal ambitions than to the empire itself. Consider what you would have done as a Roman general in the 3rd century when emperors rose and fell in a single season, and loyalty to one faction could mean your death the next. Would you fight for Rome itself or for survival? The political legacy of Rome is equally inescapable. The Republic, with its Senate, its assemblies, and its system of checks and balances, laid foundations that would inspire modern democracies. Yet the Republic's downfall also provides chilling lessons about the fragility of institutions. Corruption, factionalism, and the concentration of power in the hands of ambitious men like Caesar and Pompey shattered a system that had endured for centuries. When Augustus refashioned Rome into an empire, he did so under the guise of restoring the Republic. But it was, in truth, a masterclass in political theater. The Republic survived only in name, while true power shifted irrevocably to one man. The very title emperor has never lost its resonance. Napoleon crowned himself in Rome's shadow. Charlemagne dreamed of restoring the empire. Even modern superpowers, whether consciously or not, measure themselves against the Roman yardstick.
how much territory they control, how they project military strength, and whether their order can endure beyond their generation. To study Rome is not merely to study the past, it is to look into a mirror, one that reflects our own anxieties about power, stability, and decline. Archaeology reinforces these lessons in tangible form. Across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, the ruins of Rome stand as silent teachers. Roads stretching straight and true across continents remind us of the logistical genius that allowed legions to march swiftly to any frontier. Amphitheaters whisper of the politics of spectacle, where emperors bought the loyalty of the masses with bread and games. Forts along the Rhine and the Danube still hold the outlines of the watchtowers where legionaries once stared into barbarian lands, wondering if their empire's reach could hold. Every stone tells us not just of Rome's greatness, but of the costs it bore to maintain that greatness.
Rome's shadow is not just military and political, it is cultural, almost psychological. To be Roman was to believe in destiny, in the inevitability of expansion, in the civilizing mission of their order. This mindset created extraordinary achievements, but also justified brutal conquest. And here lies one of the most enduring questions. Was Rome's greatness worth its cruelty? Was the Pax Romana, with its centuries of relative peace across the Mediterranean, sufficient justification for the enslavement of millions, the destruction of rival cultures, and the ruthless suppression of dissent? These are questions that echo in modern debates about empire and intervention. Unknown to those Romans who lived through its decline, their story would not end with the fall of the Western Empire in 476. The Byzantine Empire carried Rome's torch for another 1,000 years, adapting its military and political systems to survive in an ever-changing world. And even when Byzantium finally fell to the Ottomans, the Roman idea did not die. It persisted in the titles of rulers, the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany, the Tsars of Russia claiming to be the Third Rome, and even in the architecture of Washington, D.C., where marble columns and domes mimic those of the Forum. Rome became not just history, but an eternal symbol of authority.
So what is the ultimate lesson of Rome's military and political legacy? Perhaps it is this: power, no matter how absolute, is always fragile. Rome's strength lay in its ability to adapt, to reform its legions, to absorb foreign peoples, to reinvent its institutions. But when adaptation slowed, when the state became rigid and corrupt, the end became inevitable. Modern powers would do well to heed that lesson. No empire, however mighty, is immune to the pressures of overextension, factional strife, and the erosion of civic virtue. And yet, Rome's grandeur continues to inspire. It is impossible not to stand before the Colosseum, the aqueducts, or the remnants of Hadrian's Wall without feeling a sense of awe at what human organization, discipline, and vision can achieve. This duality, the brilliance of Rome's order and the tragedy of its fall, is precisely why its shadow endures. It is both a model and a warning, a dream and a nightmare, an empire that seems forever alive in memory, even in death. So the question remains for us, as it did for them: can power truly be eternal? Or is every empire destined, like Rome, to one day see its legions broken, its cities abandoned, and its name carried only in memory? The Romans believed they had conquered time itself. Their empire stretched from desert to forest, from Britain to Mesopotamia. And yet, time was the one enemy even Rome could not defeat.
Perhaps that is the true legacy of Rome. Not that it fell,
but that it continues to rise again in our imaginations. Every time a nation dreams of empire, every time a general studies logistics, every time a politician invokes the grandeur of the past, Rome returns. Not as a living state, but as a timeless shadow, whispering both glory and warning to all who would follow in its path. Section 8. The Enduring Lessons of Rome. Why does Rome still matter? Why, 2,000 years after its fall, do generals, politicians, and ordinary people continue to look back at its rise and collapse as a guide for their own world? The answer is simple. Rome wasn't just a civilization, it was a mirror of power itself. To understand Rome is to understand the mechanics of human ambition, the fragility of political institutions, and the eternal tension between liberty and control. Rome's story is, above all else, one of transformation. From a cluster of huts on the Tiber, it became a republic, sustained by citizen soldiers. From that republic, it evolved into a global empire, its legions marching across continents. And from that empire, it collapsed into a memory. Yet a memory so powerful that every empire since has measured itself against Rome's shadow. But the true lesson of Rome lies not only in what it built, but in what it lost. Consider the Roman Republic. It was a system designed to prevent tyranny, with checks and balances that seemed nearly unshakable. Yet ambition found a way. Men like Marius, Sulla, Caesar, and Pompey twisted the levers of power to their own advantage. What began as temporary emergency commands became permanent grabs for supremacy. The Senate, once the guardian of tradition, degenerated into a stage for corruption and self-preservation. The tactical brilliance of Rome's generals could win victories abroad, but it was their political failures at home that eroded the Republic's foundations. When Augustus finally stepped forward, he claimed not to be a king, but a restorer of order. Yet in accepting his rule, Romans made a trade: stability for freedom, empire for republic. Would you have chosen differently if you were a Roman citizen, weary of decades of civil war? Strategically, Rome offers countless lessons still relevant today. Its legions were models of discipline and organization, capable of adapting to enemies from Celtic tribes to Parthian cavalry. Its logistics, roads, supply lines, fortifications, enabled projection of power over vast distances. Yet Rome's greatest strength was also its weakness. The very empire it built required endless expansion, constant recruitment, and ceaseless wealth to sustain. When the expansion slowed, the machine faltered. Armies turned inward, generals fought for thrones, and provinces strained under the weight of taxation. What had once been Rome's source of strength, its military engine, became a burden the empire could no longer carry. In modern terms, it was a case of strategic overreach. No empire, however mighty, can survive if its resources are stretched too thin and its internal cohesion dissolves.
But Rome's legacy is not simply a warning, it is also a foundation. Our languages, our laws, even our architecture bear its mark. The republics and democracies of the modern era consciously borrowed from Rome's example. The very word Senate, the concept of citizenship, the principle that law must outlast rulers, all trace back to Rome. Even militaries today study Roman tactics. The principles of unit cohesion, engineering on campaign, and adaptability remain as relevant in the 21st century as they were on the fields of Cannae or at the walls of Alesia. The Roman legion was more than an army. It was a school of discipline and innovation. Yet the true fascination lies in the paradox.
a civilization so advanced in organization and law, yet so vulnerable to ambition and corruption. But Rome's legacy is not simply a warning, it is also a foundation. Our languages, our laws, even our architecture bear its mark. The republics and democracies of the modern era consciously borrowed from Rome's example. The very word Senate, the concept of citizenship, the principle that law must outlast rulers, all trace back to Rome. Even militaries today study Roman tactics. The principles of unit cohesion, engineering on campaign, and adaptability remain as relevant in the 21st century as they were on the fields of Cannae or at the walls of Alesia. The Roman legion was more than an army. It was a school of discipline and innovation. Yet the true fascination lies in the paradox, a civilization so advanced in organization and law, yet so vulnerable to ambition and corruption.
Let us return to a question. Why do we still find Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon so captivating? Why do we study Augustus's careful manipulation of power? Why do we dissect the Senate's failures and the legion's triumphs? Because these are not just Roman stories, they are human stories. The names may change, the technology may advance, but the struggles remain the same. Republic versus empire, liberty versus security, ambition versus duty. Consider the fall of the Roman Republic alongside the tensions of our own world. When institutions weaken, when trust in government falters, when military power overshadows civic power, do we not see the same patterns? Rome becomes a warning written across time, whispering, "This has happened before. It can happen again."
The archaeological record reinforces this. Walk the ruins of the Forum, and you see the very stones where senators debated life and death. Explore Hadrian's Wall, and you witness the limits of Roman expansion. Study the scattered remains of amphorae and coins, and you trace the lifelines of an economy that once spanned continents. These fragments remind us that Rome was not just an idea, but a lived reality. Millions of people striving, fighting, trading, and dreaming under its banner. And yet, despite the grandeur, they too faced the uncertainty of decline. For the average Roman, the fall of Rome was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual erosion, a tax that grew heavier, a market that dwindled, a garrison that withdrew. The fall of Rome was not the end of history, but it was a turning point, a reminder that no empire, however mighty, is eternal.
So what ultimately is the enduring lesson of Rome? That power is never permanent. That ambition, left unchecked, corrodes even the strongest institutions. That military brilliance cannot compensate for political weakness. And that the greatest legacy a civilization can leave is not its monuments or conquests, but its ideas. Rome left us the idea of law, of citizenship, of civic duty. It left us cautionary tales of corruption and tyranny. It left us models of both military excellence and political fragility. In the end, Rome is not just a story of the past. It is a mirror of the present and a warning for the future.
The Roman eagle no longer flies, the legions no longer march, and the Senate no longer sits in power. Yet Rome endures, not in marble or empire, but in the lessons it carved into human history. And so we return to the question, what would you have done if you were there? On the Senate floor when Caesar rose to speak, on the battlefield when legions clashed, at the moment Augustus declared the birth of empire. Rome forces us to ask these questions because in them we see our own choices, our own ambitions, our own fragile institutions. That is why Rome still matters. That is why Rome will always matter.